record. Here we go. Oh, Sarah, where is this PowerPoint now? Is it somewhere else? Here it is. Okay. So really what I want to get into right away is putting you all into groups. So again, I recognize that all of you may be at different stages of writing this. But I will encourage you, like kind of getting into the semester, adjusting to all of the expectations. And I know that you guys are seeing clients, but I'm really going to encourage you for assignments that are due each week, to have as much of it finished as possible prior to class, because we will be talking about some of this as we go. So all of you should have access to this PowerPoint in Canvas. So I say that because once I put you into breakout rooms, I don't think you can see this anymore. And even if I put it into the chat, it kind of disappears or something like that. So if each of you could open up the PowerPoint in Canvas, just so you have these questions, I want to go ahead and throw you into breakout rooms so that you'll have a little bit of a chance to take some time to discuss this. So I'm going to put you in groups of 3 and 4. And so I'm going to give you, let's say we'll go 10 minutes. So we'll come back together at about 10:22-ish to just talk about your experience writing this. So again, honoring your level of comfort, but also recognizing that pushing yourself out of that space a little bit is important, but I don't want you to do it too quick. So if you feel comfortable taking a risk, please do. If it's something that would create so much shame in you that you wouldn't be able to look at your classmates again, please don't do that. But my hope is to, move the needle a little bit throughout this semester. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms and we'll come back together in about 10 minutes. All right. So I'll always invite you guys to do this, but sometimes you might just not want to. Really, anytime that we go into breakout rooms, if you would like to share with the larger group any particular insights or anything you learned in your groups, I would love for you to share. So does anybody have anything that they discussed in their breakout rooms with their groups that they would like to bring to the larger class?
Yeah, there were a couple kind of themes that we were talking about. And the first one was that we've written so many self-help papers before that it almost seemed, before beginning, at least for me, it was kind of an annoyance. Like it was like, gosh, I've already written about this story so many times, and now I have to do it again. But something that I've realized is every time I write about these same events, something new comes up. And there were things that popped up that I hadn't written about before, I hadn't really thought about before. And so I think in that annoyance too, and having to kind of rehash these things, I see the benefit, not only because new things are coming up, but I think I'd rather be forced to think about these things rather than them just spontaneously coming up in therapy. Yeah. So like the more we think about it and write about it now, the less likely it is that we're going to be affected by it, in the moment in therapy.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for that, Miles. And I think you're speaking to some of the control that we can have. So, sometimes when these traumatic experiences, difficulties, disappointments, losses, these things that happen to us, we can feel very helpless and almost like this passive observer of this shit that's happening to us, right? And so what I'm hearing in your process is potentially having some agency with it, feeling like every time I write about this, I'm processing it a little bit differently, and I'm feeling a little bit less controlled by this experience. So what I'm hearing you say is, in that role of therapist, you're human, you're going to be activated by something, you're going to be triggered by something, but the better that you understand your own story, the less likely it is to take up so much space in that experience or in the session. And then you can be able to kind of bracket it and process it later with your supervisor or consultation group or something. And another thing, so thank you for sharing that. And another thing that I wanted to speak to is kind of the nature of self of the therapist. So whenever I teach self of the therapist, I always liken it to an artist who's like making a sculpture or painting a painting, is that every time you do it, you're creating something a little bit different. Or you may go into it and think, all right, I have the idea, I have the plan, here's what I'm going to do. And then you get into it and you're like, wait a minute, I want to add something here. Or, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Let me put it over here. Or I think this goes better here. So I just really want to, because I think sometimes, when we think of assignments, it's like you do it and it's done. And then, and self of the therapist, the nature of it is very different. This is an assignment that you'll basically have for the rest of your life, of understanding your own story a little bit better all the time, and from different developmental stages that you're at in your life. Yeah, thank you for all of that, Miles. That was great. Anything else? Danny, was that a hand raise? Yeah. Hop on in.
Yeah, I thought actually it was a little early for the self-therapist when I first saw the assignment, because usually you get the self-therapist at the end. But for me, this weekend, it was actually really fitting because I actually got to reflect on a lot of what the chapter was discussing. It was discussing the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war in context, right? And PTSD. And like I was discussing with my colleagues, we just wrapped up the military aspect of all that. And something that hit me, like the first chapter of the book that I was describing, how the work into trauma has been sort of, its nature has been sort of an episodic amnesia, where, there's a lot of richness and abundance of, collected works, but then it all gets forgotten. And then it has to be reclaimed over and over again, right? And so I was thinking about some of the approaches to PTSD and some of the models, the treatment models, and I was noticing that, there was like a heavy emphasis on trying to kind of decipher things in regards to like the body and how the body functions and the nervous system. But then there was a component that was missing there with the psychotherapy, which were like, for me, I'm into the experiential models.
Okay.
So as I read the chapter, it feels like they were just coming around that, like, oh yeah, well, there's this experiential kind of aspect to psychotherapy that we've left out, and it has to be reintroduced again.
You mean with the
movement.
connection to the body? Is that what you mean by the experiential?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Like more somatic.
Absolutely.
Right. That stuff. Like, because in the chapter it says, CBT and the cognitive behavioral therapy is really, really popular for the military, because it has a very standardized approach, right? The book talks about trying to standardize psychotherapy. And so the military's nature, just by its nature, it's really, it's attracted to a model like CBT.
Of course, the more people we can try to apply it to, the better. And insurance companies love that. So yeah, my hope is that we're kind of outgrowing that a little bit and seeing the importance of individuating and catering what we do to the individual, rather than saying, all right, there's 17 of us in here. CBT is an evidence-based practice. So regardless of your trauma, how you've processed it, your lived experience, your social position, anything like that, let's just slap this manualized thing on us because it should work for everybody. And then we'll have about a 20% success rate, and we'll be like, that's pretty good.
Right.
We tried. Yep.
It even described right there that the dropout rates, CBT, were pretty high. And so was the prolonged exposure that, again, didn't have that I guess you could say a humanistic kind of perspective. They just went in on, there was a case right there that they described, right? About how they just went into the model, but they hadn't established therapeutic alliance.
That's exactly what I was about to say, because CBT basically says it doesn't explicitly state this, but that's not an emphasized piece of CBT, is the human piece of how about you see if you can trust me because it's trying to eliminate therapist characteristics, therapist factors of saying it shouldn't matter who provides this. That's what the beauty of the manual is. So regardless of if you trust me, if you have any biases or anything like that, we're going to try to control for that. And I'm just going to give you the care. And what we're learning, particularly with trauma, you can't do that. You have to build that human bond that is so beautiful that we can cultivate in that room.
Definitely. And just to kind of finalize my thought right here, it was a fitting, it just fitted, the assignment fit with what was going on this weekend. And I reflected on, because when I remember this thing with the Afghanistan war, I remember being on board the aircraft carrier and being part of those operations and watching all the, just watching and participating in all that, and being part of the effort and the violence of all that action. But then coming back 20 years later, and finding myself writing about how now my effort is to sort of, like the book describes, reclaim some of the work in trauma, because that's what's coming down the pipeline, obviously, is all of the trauma. So now I feel like I'm on the other end of that spectrum and being part of the effort to help heal and recover from all that trauma. So yeah, I really appreciated the assignment this weekend. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Danny. Anything else? All right, I'll pop back into the PowerPoint. So before I get into like highlighting some of the things from the epilogue and from the chapter on captivity, I really wanted to just go over some definitions for you. So this class is called Trauma and Crisis Intervention. So let's define trauma and better understand and kind of unpack crisis. So this is not anything you can't look up. So the Dsm definition of trauma. So the DSM has the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder there, but there is also a definition of trauma that is quite different from the definition of trauma that we had in the DSM-4 text revised. And I'll go over some of the critiques of that because people aren't really happy about the changes in the definition. So essentially it is exposure to actual or threatened death. So that's this first little piece here is what's considered criterion 1 or criterion A. So you cannot kind of move to any other criteria, or you can't meet criteria for PTSD if you don't have an element of criterion A. And criterion A is probably the most largely criticized criteria of trauma or PTSD. So, because PTSD is really the only diagnosis that we have that has to do with trauma. We do have like the diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder. There's lots of critiques of that. It is a largely unpopular diagnosis in our field. But anyway, trauma, exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So we're looking at things that we've directly experienced, things that we witness in person. That is a clear distinction that's made because it can't be something that you witness like in media. Like you have to be physically in the same space as whatever event is happening. So also it would be considered learning that a traumatic event has occurred to, and these are there's very specific language here, a close family member or friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental. So again, very specific criteria here that really minimizes its application. Experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. So for example, first responders, collecting human remains, police officers being exposed to details of child abuse, many other kind of frontline individuals. It could be nurses, doctors. I mean, I don't know how much would apply to us, but I would argue that what we do can be pretty inherently traumatic with the sharing. But it wouldn't meet any criteria because it would be, so let's say we hear it from clients, they're not close family members or close friends. So that wouldn't be considered traumatic for us. Okay, so some criticisms. Again, criterion A, I've broken it down here, that actual or threatened death. So the interesting thing, I don't really like the term interesting, so I always challenge myself to not use it. So I feel like it's a very like devoid of any value, right? Like so many things could be interesting and that doesn't really tell you what I think of it. So I'm going to challenge myself to be a little bit more specific here. I think one of the frustrating things with this definition is that it excludes experiences that are very meaningful and very impactful But so as we know, there's a catch-22 with diagnoses, right? Like, so the like kind of positive piece of it can be access to resources, you know, insurance coverage, that kind of stuff. But that's, you know, assuming you have insurance or access to insurance. But the negative piece of that is this label and potentially really feeling identified by this label. So we have this catch-22 in the area of diagnosis in our field. And I think that's why MFTs lean away from it a little bit. But again, if you're playing the game in insurance, you know, you gotta slap some labels on people. But anyway, so the actual or threatened death may not fully give the appropriate weight to experiences where you may not feel like your life is in danger, but you are absolutely impacted by the experience that you had or the vicarious experience that you've had. So then there's serious injury, sexual violence. So basically what this is saying is stressful events not involving an immediate threat to life or physical injury, like a psychosocial stressor, so a job loss, a divorce. So these are not considered trauma by this DSM definition. Then, so an example here is medical trauma. For example, if this person experiences a non-immediate, non-catastrophic, life-threatening illness, such as cancer, this does not qualify for trauma, regardless of how stressful or severe it was. So it's just this very specific language. So one of the criticisms of the DSM-5 definition is that it's much more exclusive from the DSM-4 definition, and it really eliminates care for individuals. So individuals who would have met criteria in the DSM-4 no longer meet criteria with DSM-5, and there's no research to support it. So for those of you, so just a refresher or maybe new information, I'm not sure. The DSM comes out about every 7 years-ish, and it's supposed to be really informed by research. So we're researching these diagnoses, we're researching constructs of diagnoses or constructs of struggles. And then the purpose is to enhance and be more appropriate and relevant to have the criteria be more appropriate and relevant for the diagnosis. And unfortunately, what's happened with the DSM definition of trauma and for the criteria for PTSD is there's no support behind the changes that were made. So no empirical evidence for that. So like I said, DSM-4 criteria is more inclusive than DSM-5. So many people have kind of lost some of their resources due to the new criteria and definitions. So if you're interested in reading a little bit more about a critique of the DSM-5 definition and criteria, feel free to click on that link. So just going over some major types of trauma so I'll be also differentiating for you big T or capital T trauma and lowercase or little t trauma. So you are all able to read. So take a couple of seconds to look over this list. And I'm curious if, as you read this, if there's any type of trauma that you feel is missing. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list or anything, but just curious if anybody has any thoughts on anything that's not on the list that you think should be.
You did mention earlier medical trauma. I think that's something that is missing from the list.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and with the new definition, it wouldn't fit, it's gnarly to me how affected people are with that. And then for people who make the criteria for this to be no, I don't think it's enough. To me, it's just so insensitive.
I have a quick question. Does
Sure.
refugee or forced migration fall under any of these categories?
So I don't know if like the status would necessarily, but if you think of like war or political violence, those would. So then that's kind of like the precipitator to being a refugee or experiencing forced immigration. So I would think, I can confirm this, that would actually fall under this.
Thank you.
Of course. Oops. Any other things that may not be on here that you think should be included?
I just
All
have a question. Sorry.
No, you're good.
So this list is what falls under the definition, the new definition of the DSM-5, or this is just types of trauma?
So both. And I give you this list to help you kind of conceptualize and assess in your clients, because sometimes the like affective response. So we'll learn about, well, you guys read about constricting. And so we'll talk a little bit more about constricting, but just pretty like nonchalantly discussing these things. So again, just because somebody experienced what may fall under a category of trauma, like doesn't necessarily mean that their, everyday functioning is compromised or that they're very, very affected by this. But they may not all, their affect and the way that they recall or discuss the trauma that they've experienced doesn't always match how it may actually be affecting them because of the circumstances of survival, right? So, we read about that in captivity, but I'll talk more in depth about that. So these are just things to be aware of that can really affect individuals. And yes, both of those things that you just asked about. All right, so let's go ahead. And so again, referring to the PowerPoint in Canvas, so we can discuss this. Sorry, I'm just really a mess with the PowerPoint today. So I want you to think into your caseloads here, or if you don't have a caseload, or if you don't necessarily have clients that you think fit into this, feel free to pull into your personal bank of memories, or maybe family or friends that you're kind of aware of. So looking at the definition, reflecting on the definition that I just shared of trauma and some of the major traumas that are expressed and experienced, go ahead and think about the caseload that you have. And I'm going to put you into the breakout rooms, and we'll probably actually spend the rest of our hour in there. So about 15 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break and then come back into our into class. So I'll go ahead and stop the share so I can put you into breakout rooms. And I'm just going to stick you'll be in the same breakout rooms all day. So I will see you in about 15 minutes. All right, so we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and share if you'd like, but then we're gonna go into some more breakout rooms before I kind of dominate the second hour of this class. So I will see you back here at about 11:10. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and come back. All right, so let's go ahead and keep rocking here. So anything that anyone would like to share about talking with your client, talking about your clients, and anything that you've seen clinically in terms of trauma? And I'm particularly interested in your systemic conceptualization of trauma. So understanding how an individual's trauma was affected by a system, or how their trauma affected a system.
Can you ask the whole question again? I'm sorry, I was like late to getting back.
Oh, that's okay. So curious if anything was shared in your group from a systemic perspective of trauma. So anything that you've seen clinically where an individual's trauma affected a system that they were part of, or an individual's trauma was affected by a system that they were a part of. So understanding kind of like the bidirectional nature of that. We'll talk about that a little in just a few minutes.
A case that I have with my client came to mind, so let me know if this applies. But basically she her mom had a stroke, and she's in high school, like just starting after COVID, and
Sure.
just a lot of different factors came into play when that happened, and she's the only caretaker, like as a sophomore for her mom, so the teachers were really concerned about her, and so they asked the practicum site that that I'm at,
Sure.
if someone can speak to her and talk to her. So I guess for me, it seems like, just the system, like the school system, in a positive way, was able to support her enough to get someone else to kind of gather around as she's experiencing this, that does inadvertently affect her schoolwork and her being able to be present in school and, learn and things like that. So I think that's what came to my mind when you asked that
Yeah, so
question.
you're talking about how a system positively affected her experience of trauma. So again, I think that, I shared definitions for it, just so you know kind of what you're working with, but also understanding that doesn't always clinically apply. Like a dictionary definition or a conceptual or theoretical definition doesn't always show up exactly perfectly in clinical work, as you probably have all known or seen. Like, I'm just thinking of that joining process where if somebody, like, just imagine going to a therapist and being like, I've experienced this trauma, and the therapist being like, all right, like, let me know what you've experienced, and being like, actually, that doesn't meet the definition of trauma. That's not actually trauma. So to me, that's like incredibly unattuned to it, because sometimes we're using terms that may not be like clinical definitions, but that's how the client is experiencing it. So the validation of that is very important. And so, I mean, there's a line with it, I guess. So if you're kind of seeing this pattern victimization or something like that, that's different. And like those definitions, but I share it with you so you have like a working conceptualization of it, but also be prepared in your clinical work that that's not always how clients function. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Summer. Like, does that qualify as a trauma? I would say absolutely. That's a little T trauma by definition, but it also depends on how the client is responding to it, coping with it, you know, just being affected by it in terms of functioning and stuff like that. So yeah, systems absolutely are helpful in that. And I think that brings up I think you bring up an important piece too, of sometimes clients not necessarily needing to, like their main reason for coming to therapy or engaging in therapy may not be to like process and engage in the therapeutic process, if that makes sense. It's really them kind of looking for resources. And I think that's an overlooked piece of what we do is like, we come in and we're like, oh, you're in our care, so now we must do talk therapy. And I think that sometimes we overlook like the case management piece of what we do. And sometimes it's about understanding and connecting to other systems and making sure that that person is fully supported. Like we talked about last week of, you know, having some of those basic needs met, we're recognizing that like processing a trauma is a couple of steps up that scale where you need to make sure everything is safe first for them just on an everyday, like a day-to-day basis. All right, so now let's talk about crisis. So again, wanting to engage with you guys in these small groups first. So I know that you can kind of see it on the side. So if you could not look at the next slide. And what I want you to do is in your group, so I'll give you just a couple of minutes here, is your like working definition of a crisis or your conceptualization of a crisis. And then again, as much as you can, share about a recent crisis that you've experienced. So I'll give you like 3 minutes to do this. I'll send you back into those breakout rooms. I'll see you at 11:20. All right, so I gather that maybe you needed a little bit more time since nobody popped out of there early. Okay, so I won't, unless anybody feels like super compelled to share, I'm not necessarily going to ask you to do that. I think it's more important in those like intimate spaces. I don't want to take anything away from anyone, but I won't make y'all do that. Okay, so we're going to go into breakout rooms one more time, but I want to talk with you a little bit about this. So again, working understanding of some of these definitions and essentially how like crisis and trauma differ. So one of the really important pieces and kind of breaking down the definition of a crisis is about perspective. So we talk about the concept of social constructivism, right? And that really is understanding that multiple realities are possible. So even in, the experience of our class, we essentially have 17 different perspectives, 17 different perceptions of the content that we learn, the format, all of that kind of stuff. So just, and I think by nature of us being systemic thinkers, that we lean into the belief that multiple perspectives absolutely exist and they're important to consider. So working definition of crisis here is a perception or experiencing of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the person's current resources and coping mechanisms. So essentially breaking this down. So looking at an exception or a perception, the experiencing of an event or situation that is perceived as being intolerably difficult, and also exceeding the person's current resources and coping mechanisms. So if I could kind of bullet point that for you, that these would be the components that you would be looking at of understanding a person in crisis. And this is important because what's one of the first things that we do when we work with a client is crisis management, right? So if a person is coming to us in crisis, we have to take care of that crisis first and make sure that we return them as close to baseline as possible before moving into any of the work. So understanding how a crisis, an individual can react to a crisis. So understanding how they cope. So, as we know, there are so many options of how to cope. Adaptive, maladaptive, depending on, your perspective and in terms of like the longitudinal like sustainability of that choice. So as we know, in crisis, people can cope with, calling friends on the phone, substance use, alcohol, self-injury. There's so many different approaches to this. And so we have to understand. So again, for assessment purposes, understanding how that person has been coping with this crisis that may bring them into therapy, or how they've coped with crises in the past. And I think that that's an important question to ask as well, understanding that evolution and that growth and that change that may have happened in terms of coping skills. So when an individual is in crisis, as we know, people can cope individually or independently and collaboratively. Sometimes they do a mix of both. I would argue that one or the other is not necessarily better than the other. The one thing that you do want to look for with any sort of independent coping is isolation, and any sort of collaborative coping is a potential like codependency of, this inability to differentiate and to cope or react to this on their own. Does anybody need any clarification on that? So again, it's not a good or bad thing, but there are patterns that you may need to look for. So, hyper independence or hyper collaborative. An opportunity in this. So we talked about this last week of, this post-traumatic growth. So another reason to assess current crisis, any sort of historical crises, growth in the process of, what did you learn? How are they conceptualizing this? So this is something that can take some time, and quite frankly can feel kind of patronizing or minimizing, is to be like, well, this is a growth opportunity for you. Sometimes people aren't ready to hear that, and it can be very minimizing and devaluing. So, but there is that potential perspective on that. And then, are they reacting with blocking, constricting, a numbness? So one thing that I do want to point out in terms of our idea of numbness, I think sometimes when we talk about numbness, it's a void of feeling. And I would argue that it's an overwhelm of so many feelings that it's like your body kind of almost shuts down in response to that. So I would like you to be open to the idea that numbness doesn't necessarily mean no emotions. It can mean I have so many emotions, it's difficult to parse through them. Therefore, I'm really not going to lean into feeling any of this because I'm completely overwhelmed. So just that, because that can guide some of the questions that you ask, some of the ways that you engage with your clients when they say, I'm just feeling numb. Okay, so another thing to think about, and we can just share here in the large group, is how in your clinical work, you've experienced your clients dealing with crisis, and maybe how you have historically coped with crisis. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to share in terms of the coping that they've witnessed in their clients and the coping that they've engaged in, that you've engaged in when you've experienced a crisis?
I guess I have something to share because yeah, I don't know. It's just like been difficult to navigate with a client who's just been going through a lot. But when I first started seeing her, like it didn't seem like she was in crisis. And then as she started like sharing her story and her trauma, pretty much, not pretty much, like her traumas that she's been through, now she's kind of like, seems like she's in a state of crisis. And
Okay.
like what she's asking for, like our last session, she was pretty adamant about like wanting medication because she can't concentrate and she can't sleep, and she's anxious all the time, and like it's hard to even be around people.
Sure.
Like from my perspective and like what I gathered, it seems like just so all of it is linked to her trauma coming up and like how her body and her mind are responding to it. And I don't know, it's just that's been, so I've like gave her resources.
Sure.
And I guess, yeah, I just didn't like, I don't know if I expected that it to happen so quickly as like her trauma came up, and then right away her body was kind of like, and her mind were kind of like, no, this is too much. Like we've still been talking about things and working through things, but maybe it's been like too fast or just too much that it just was never part of the conversation about medication, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then it was like an immediate, she kind of expressed that she felt like she had an immediate need for it. And this is like the first client that I had any experience of them asking about like resources for that. And then there's also like the counter transference or like my own beliefs and concerns about medication that came up, and like navigating it, but then doing what's best for her because she's in crisis and that's what she needs. So yeah, I guess I'll stop there. That's
Okay.
It's been
Well,
a
if I can give you a little
experience.
bit of feedback here, because I hear you having a couple of concerns clinically of like, did I misstep? Did I push? It did something. Is that what I'm hearing? Is like, did I kind of, was I a catalyst to this in any way? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, because I guess I kind of feel concerned that like at the beginning of Bill, because I've only been seeing her for, this is like our, I think our last session was our 5th session.
Mhm.
So I guess there's a concern of like, did I miss something earlier? Could I have asked more questions about like her, you know, if she was in a crisis at the beginning?
Sure.
To have it like all, it just felt like it was all of a sudden. So yes, it did feel like, oh, did I miss something?
Yeah.
Or like, is this too quick?
So a couple of things. I do want to normalize that is, you know, this is a learning process, right? So I just always think of the, you know, consent forms that you sign, that as a company ages, it just becomes longer and longer and longer because they're like, oh shit, didn't expect this to happen. Need to add a line about this. Oh, would have never thought that this is going to happen. Need to add a line about this. So that's why, you know, contracts and stuff can get so long, but that's no different than what we experience as clinicians in like, so now this is a learning opportunity for you to be like, okay, maybe there's an assessment that I want to include in my intake. You know, maybe there's a handful of questions that I'm finding are important for me to know early on. Also recognizing that clients need safety to answer accurately, or to even be in a headspace to realize that it's something that they need. So one, I want to normalize just the growing process of you clinically, in that you're going to learn, okay, these are some assessment questions that I want to ask earlier on. And I'm learning that through my clients, which is because it's, again, a bidirectional experience. And then two, if you're curious or maybe concerned about the pacing of your therapy, of like, oh my gosh, did I induce a crisis? I would argue that likely you didn't. I think sometimes and I say this in all humility of like, we're not that important in a client's life. Like we're a little piece. And I just think like sometimes we think we have a lot more influence over clients than we really do. So just think of all the extra therapeutic time. So even if you're seeing a client 1 hour a week, there's 168 hours in a week. You see them for one. So they have 167 times more experiences outside of you. So just, you know, food for thought on that. But if you're wondering, ask them, hey, curious about the pacing here. Are we talking about things that are important to you? Can we back up a little bit and understand a little bit more about this thing that feels new? I always encourage you to engage your clients in the process, particularly if they're seeing, so I think that we should get client feedback all the time. I think it's especially important. So in terms of agency consent, when somebody comes to you having been violated in some way, having boundaries violated in some way, having their voice not being heard, experiencing some sort of like institutional discrimination or institutional silencing, give them voice in the process. So if you're ever curious, as a researcher, and I promise I see humans as humans, but if you're looking at this in any sort of research way, your data point is right in front of you. Ask your data, ask who is going to give you the answers better than anybody can, better than any theory, better than any conceptualization. The human is right in front of you. Engage them in that process. So thank you for bringing that up, Paige. I think it's important because also clients don't always come to us in crisis. Sometimes as they're gathering resources, as they're creating boundaries, as they're, growing in the process, then sometimes the systems that they're a part of kind of fight back, right? So systems like homeostasis. So then that can encourage or create a crisis when homeostasis is interrupted. Or they're going through this processing and they may not be at a place where they thought they were. And that doesn't mean that you misstepped or that it's catastrophic or anything like that. It's a time to pause and then make sure that reinforce those boundaries, and then proceed at the pace that feels good and safe for them. But you have to engage them in that process to know. We can't guess about safety. Does all of that make sense? Does anybody need any additional information? Okay,
I
That's
really,
super helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
of course. Yeah, Danny.
yeah, I really appreciate your description there, and then your note about like sort of the self of therapist work on that end of like how much responsibility do we have over our clients? Like what do we assume? What responsibility do we assume at the end of the day, right? Because
Absolutely.
it's their lives, they're living their lives, and like you
Yeah.
said, it took a while to realize, because I would also kind of have the same, like how Paige is experiencing, you know, like trying to figure out, and that's worth analyzing and processing for your own, you know, that'll never stop. But at the end of the day, it's like how you said, most of the therapeutic process will take outside of therapy. In that sense, they're only there 1 hour out of the week, out of all those hours you mentioned. And then they come back and they have their cathartic moment or deal with their crisis or set the boundaries, or like you said, the system fights back or something. And that's where all of the real work is really happening, is outside the setting. They're just coming in to basically check in and basically get some feedback. And I think even Dr. Dodris, I like how you described it. It's like you're basically the second brain in the room. You're the extra brain.
Yeah.
That's actually given. So yeah.
Yeah. And so thank you for that. So one of the other things so remember, you see people at their worst. It's a privilege to do that. And it's an indication of some safety in the room, right? So I also don't want us to misconstrue what a crisis may mean. It may not mean a misstep. It may mean that the process is working and now they're at a space of safety to break down, to have their defenses down, to really show you something that maybe they've been holding in that's been protected. Yeah, Gavin.
Yeah, I just to kind of say what you were about to say. I'll give you the best example. 2019, I was that person that you're describing. You know, my anxiety was so bad. I literally drove from LA to Woodland Hills to I believe to Kaiser, and I just said like, you know, I can't handle my anxiety anymore. It's great, like it's just making me go crazy. And like you said, you know, at that point, all barriers, everything just, you know, I just pulled everything off and I just said, I'm willing to do it. And so yesterday, when I met with my client for the first time, you know, they spilled everything. You know, like I didn't expect that, right? And I don't know if anybody else would expect that, but they just came out and said, you know, that I'm non-binary. I want to be called by this name. And, you know, I, you know, cut myself, self-harm. And so when you hear all of that, obviously there's, you know, for me at least, there's like that thought in the back of my head. I was like, damn, like, you know, I guess it's a bad thing to do, but like you compare your situation to their situation, but in reality, that's not the case.
Yeah.
Their situation is much different to ours.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing, Gavin. I was curious if that comparison process happened at all with any of you when you were sharing about your ACEs scores. Because sometimes we can really engage, I think particularly in our field, we can engage in kind of the like oppression or suffering Olympics, for lack of a better term, of I'm only equipped to help somebody with this if I've experienced this, or oh my gosh, I have no frame of reference for this. How can I ever be of use? But then we go to the other end of this too and say, how can I possibly help others? I'm so broken, I'm so whatever. So just thank you so much for that, Gavin, of we do tend to engage in that process. So just, you know, the kind of cliche that suffering is relative, and to remember that you can connect to your client how we connect to other humans is not necessarily through lived experiences, but the emotions that are evoked from those experiences. So one of the, I think I shared this in class last week. I lost my mom to cancer several years ago. And so I don't need a therapist to have lost their mother in their 20s. I need a therapist to understand the feeling of loss in some way. And sometimes loss can be the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a future that you thought you had. So I don't ever want you to think that you can't connect to clients because you have a very different lived experience than the client does. I also don't want you to assume that similarities will be shared, if that makes sense. So if, like, let's say that your social position is one thing, but you have one characteristic that's similar to your client, you can't necessarily depend on that similarity. So if I'm working with a woman who is not white, I can't assume that our womanhood is something that's just automatically going to connect us, because that might not be the case. But in terms of emotional experiences, I do think that's what the basis of empathy is, connecting to that piece of you and then extending that connection to the client that's expressing it to you. Okay, let's go into this PowerPoint again. We're making it. So looking again at crisis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecological socioecological model, or the socioecological framework. It's called a bunch of different things. But one of the things that really separates us from other mental health professionals is our systemic view of people and the relationships with that. So one of the things that I really want you to get out of the habit of doing is looking at anything linearly. As couple and family therapists, we do not conceptualize really anything linearly, with very few exceptions. So cause and effect, this happened, therefore this happened. So that insinuates a timeline of some sort. And our goal is to broaden the timeline and to expand the players that are kind of in the scenario. So really briefly, I don't know if this is a review. So if it's not review for you, please let me know, but I'm going to just go over these systems. So also what I will say is this cause and effect description is it's called linear causality. That's what we call it. What we function out of as couple and family therapists is what's called circular causality. So that means that a thing happened, somebody responded to that response, then somebody responded to that response of that response. There's also historical components that inform how I responded. There's lived experiences that inform how I respond. There's personality characteristics that inform how I respond. So there's all kinds of variables that are not neatly at all in this cause and effect description. So circular causality is how we view. Okay, so very quickly here, we have the individual who's coming to see us, or, we have the individual in front of us who may be part of a system in the room as well. So they may be coming as part of a couple, they may be coming as part of a family, but then there's the microsystem. So you can see these are just some examples of things that are in the microsystem. So these are systems that directly affect the individual, like their family, the school that they may be a part of, any sort of health services, their faith community, any peers. So these are systems that directly affect the individual. So then the mesosystem is how the microsystems interact with one another. So how does the family interact with the church community? How does the school how is it influenced by and influence this individual's peers? So mesosystem is the interaction between microsystems. Then the exosystem is systems that indirectly affect the individual. So this could be, so for example, if this individual is a child And you can see too, like the individual characteristics of this person absolutely affects their lived experience, right? So thinking of intersections of identities, social position, access to resources, all of the characteristics of this individual affect this individual's experience because of how those characteristics are conceptualized and responded to by these larger systems. So I digress a little bit. I went a little out of order. But so for example, if this individual is a child, then in the exosystem, this may be parents' work. So the parents' work indirectly affects the child because, for example, like any stressors that happen at work, the parent may come home and project or displace maybe their frustration onto the child. So the work didn't directly do anything, or the work environment didn't directly do anything to the child, but it very much indirectly affected that child. So that would be considered an exosystem. So again, mass media doesn't necessarily directly affect anybody, but it absolutely indirectly affects us. Then we have the macro system, I think, and this is the one thing, one of the areas that we really want to punctuate and highlight in terms of cultural competency. We never, and because I don't use definitives very often, but I feel very comfortable saying it right here. We never look at individuals or families in a vacuum. We always have to understand, again, another definitive, the influences of the larger systemic system, I guess, systemic system. So these are attitudes and ideologies of the culture. So one thing that I also want to emphasize here, because we're talking about it, is big C culture, little c culture. So sometimes when we think of culture, we minimize that or only think of like, maybe country of origin or ethnicity. But there's like, for example, the culture of California, the culture of Los Angeles, just because that's where we are, the culture of Alliant International University. So there's like smaller cultures seated within larger cultures. And then as we know, there's, cultural conflict that can happen, particularly with somebody who is used to or has grown up in one culture and then is placed in or moves into a different culture. So the macro system affects the exosystem, which affects the mesosystem, which affects the microsystem, which affects the individual. So that's where this cause and effect description just doesn't fit. Okay, so now what I want to do is show you a video of a crisis that happened. And then what we're going to do is go into breakout rooms again and talk about the microsystem influences, the mesosystem influences, exo and macro system influences. So I'll keep sharing and show you a YouTube video. Here we go.
Next tonight, something different. Imagine millions of people.
Can you all hear that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Watch your life come unglued. An all-out panic attack on TV.
So yes, this ultimately is a advertisement for this book, but it's relevant.
It happened to our Dan Harris, but his journey of discovery brought back some lessons for all of us about our lives too, and he's telling us about it tonight, Dan.
Hi, Dan. This is a very personal story, as you know, because you were right there when it all started. Sometimes there are things holding us back from being happy, and we're not aware of it until life hits us over the head with a frying pan. And that is what happened to me.
From ABC News, this is Good Morning America.
Welcome to the most embarrassing day of my life.
We're going to go now to Dan Harris, who's at the news desk. Dan.
Good morning, Charlie and Diane. Thank you. This is me 10 years ago. And the reason this is the most embarrassing day of my life is not that it looks like I've been attacked by a blow dryer and a can of hairspray. No, it's that I am about to freak out on national television. Health news now, one of the world's most commonly prescribed medications may be providing a big bonus. Researchers report people who take cholesterol-lowering drugs called statins for at least 5 years may also lower their risk for cancer. But it's too early to prescribe statins slowly for cancer production. At this point, I realize I'm helpless, so I bail right in the middle. That does it for news. We're going to go back now to Robin and Charlie.
All right, thanks very much, Dan Harris at the news desk with some of the headlines of the morning. Want to go to Tony Perkins now. He is.
Once the fear subsided, humiliation rushed in. I knew with rock solid certainty that I had just had a panic attack on national television. So why would I tell you this very embarrassing story? Because that on-air meltdown was the culmination of something that had been building for years, something I never stopped to address. It's something we all battle, whether we have panic attacks or not. Call it the voice in your head.
That's where I feel stress.
It's the inner narrator that can control us.
Highly critical.
Get in the way of living the life we want to lead. For Brian Simmons, it was outbursts of anger.
I would act very reactively, very
For Becky
angrily.
Schmitz, it was emotional eating.
Eating was like my security blanket.
And for a young Dr. Mehmet Oz, it was a racing mind that kept him from focusing on one thing at a time.
For me, saying a voice in the head is too benign an expression of what really happens. That massive cacophony that we hear, deafeningly loud.
Does it surprise you at all how much time we all spend fixating on these self-defeating voices we hear?
I have always been surprised how much time we spend wasting on the voices in our head telling us we're not good enough.
In my case, like many Americans, my inner voice was pushing me to succeed. Annual New Year's party in New York. This is me in my late 20s.
Thank you, Dan. Dan Harris.
I had my dream job, but I also had doubts about whether I was good enough. But it's hard to do that. All right, I'm going to try it. 3, 2, 1. My solution? Become a workaholic. After 9/11, I volunteered to spend years in war zones where I covered the heroics of our men and women overseas and got a real taste of both the horror and the adrenaline of combat. After years of always barreling forward, when I finally slowed down, it was as if my mind revolted and I got depressed. And so in my free time, I briefly but stupidly began self-medicating. And it was those recreational drugs, my doctor would later tell me, that almost certainly produced the on-air panic attack. But losing it in front of 5 million people became a turning point. It set me off on a strange, unplanned odyssey, the kind of search so many of us embark upon for answers, understanding, and strength. Ultimately, it would lead me to something I never would have expected, as it has for Dr. Oz and millions of others.
Going inside my mind is no longer going behind enemy lines.
After a journey that involved megachurches, self-help gurus, and brain researchers, what I found is something simple, scientifically tested, and completely free. It's being done by executives, pro athletes, and even the U.S. Marines. It's not a miracle cure, but I like to say it makes you about 10% happier. Much more on that tomorrow night.
All right. So the one thing that I do want to speak to is his comment about stupidly engaging in self-medication. So that to me identifies a bias, right? And I also think that it's a pretty insensitive, kind of unempathic way to conceptualize substance use. So this, this is something, so again, I say that to you as therapists and as human beings of individuals coming into your space who have suffered and who have struggled. And if the first thing that or if one of the things that they disclose to you is, I've used substances, I've, self-medicated in these ways, I don't want you to look at them and go, well, why did you do that? That was a really poor choice. But I also think, so again, we're kind of, going into the meso macro exosystem of the stigma of substance use, right? And the dehumanization and how, this is a choice, and what a stupid choice that this person, you knew what you were getting into and you did it anyway. So I think, that very individual onus with substance use in particular, I think it's a very easy way to dehumanize somebody, dismiss somebody, quite frankly, because we're not very good at helping individuals who are in that space, not only in our field, but I think largely as a society. It's just easier to turn our head the other way and say, well, that was their personal choice and I had nothing to do with that, and I disagree with that. And so any continued suffering that comes onto them, that's self-inflicted. So that's the only thing that I really want to speak to. Step on my soapbox for a second, and I'll get off. But so let's go ahead and how do you guys feel about taking a break first or going into breakout rooms first? So in the breakout rooms, what we're going to be doing is talking about them, from that clip, looking at microsystem influences or factors, mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem. So identifying all of the factors that were noted in his story and what may have influenced this panic attack and some of the coping with the panic attack. So would you guys rather talk in breakout rooms first or take a break? There's no right. So whoever answers first will speak for the group if you guys. So who wants to take a break? Okay, you guys want to go into breakout rooms? Okay, so let's spend about 15 minutes. Well, how about this? I'll check in at 10. Let's spend about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms to talk about micro, meso, exo, macro system effects on this. All right, back into your rooms. I'll see you in about 10 minutes. About 45 minutes left. So first, what I want to do, so again, really wanting to emphasize our systemic view of anything coming to us clinically. What did you all identify as factors within, was his name Dan? Dan's microsystem that influenced his experience of a panic attack, the precipitating events of the panic attack, how he coped. Also, spoiler alert for you, the 10% better is about mindfulness, like meditation and stuff like that, for anybody who is curious. So microsystem influences.
We really struggled coming up with any microsystem stuff because I feel like it wasn't mentioned all that much in the clip.
Okay.
But something that I think it was Jen mentioned, just the peers surrounding him in the studio. It seemed like during that panic attack, he just, and back to you, and then they just continued. And it was, I imagine that's got to be a difficult scenario where it's like, you need support, but at the same time you're on live TV and like kind of the show must go on kind of thing. And we didn't really get to see what happened, when they went to a break or anything like that. But getting a little ahead of myself, but I feel like that's connected to the exosystem and his workplace and like the expectation of a news reporter. They're not supposed to show emotion, right? They're supposed to just present facts, and even the voice that he was using while explaining his panic attack was very, news reporter.
Yeah.
So I think those two are kind of connected.
Yeah, so Miles, actually, just to polish what you said a little bit. So the microsystem, his work is in the microsystem, but the exosystem would kind of be like the policies around media. So they are different in terms of him being, so remember, microsystem is what he's directly, or what an individual is directly affected by, and the exosystem is more indirectly affected. So like policies, procedures within a workplace would be considered within the exosystem. So your group did identify something in the microsystem. What about the mesosystem? So anything that, so how microsystems interact, or the interaction of any microsystems. What did you guys talk about in your groups? Did you just stare at each other?
Our group was
10 minutes.
also experiencing kind of troubles with the microsystem and mesosystem.
Okay.
Just because we didn't know so much about maybe the influences, I mean, that he had like by his family.
Okay.
Maybe I don't know where he grew up. But I think that those would be kind of influences on like maybe how his family views, you know, individuals in the workplace or
Perfect.
what people should be doing for a job. So we don't really know how maybe his family looked at like journalism or being kind of this, you know, news reporter, how they kind of looked at that within their kind of family culture.
Yeah.
But I think that those would be some things that would play a big part in how he's then kind of looking at, okay, well, maybe if I show my family that I'm working so much, then they'll kind of take it kind of seriously, or those are just hypotheticals, but just kind of ideas.
Yeah. So
like that nature.
Jada, I love that. So I think without knowing really anything about, is it Dan, the person personally, that is a very relevant, educated approach to take. So to make, so, you know, we talk about in our field, like not making assumptions, but sometimes assumptions are needed for something. So to assume that his family of origin experiences and the way that his family views his current work, and the workplace environment, that they interact at some point to influence him, I think that's a pretty fair assumption. So that's a beautiful example of a mesosystem. So it sounds like maybe you guys, did you have more to say at the macro system, at the macro level of this? All right, so what did you guys identify in the macro system?
Just real quick, I wanted to add, because I originally wrote this in exosystem, but now I think it may be more microsystem, mesosystem, but kind of what Jada was saying, but being in this, I don't want to use the word industry, but being in the job that he has is going to be really similar to what we're experiencing, which is exposure, like repetitive exposure to these potentially traumatic events or stories, or you know, these like extremely difficult things to talk about, but yet he's expected to just talk about them nonchalantly and just presenting the facts. And how that might, you know, he's going to bring that home with him to his family. And now we're just making assumptions about what that interaction looks like. But yeah, how his work with these difficult stories can affect his private life with friends and family.
Yeah, so I would argue that that's mesosystem. And I will also say you don't necessarily need to make assumptions about how, like, the space that his family holds for him. That would be an assessment piece. So again, one of the purposes of me introducing this to you or having us dive into this is, as you're learning about the individual, you want to ask questions like that. So tell me a little bit about your family. Tell me a little bit about how your family feels about the line of work that you're in. When you have these difficult experiences, or, you know, cover these stories that are very emotional for you and difficult for you, do you interact with anybody about it? Do you share this with anybody? How do they generally respond to you? Do you feel heard, validated, understood? What are some things that people can provide you for you to feel like this is a safe, productive space for you to enter into to discuss this? So that would be how you incorporate the micro, meso, exo system into this. So macro system, so he talks about mental health, right? So what's our culture around mental health? People who seek mental health services are super effed up, right? I'm fine. I don't need to seek this because I'm not broken. I have resources. I hope it's changing a little bit. I feel like the younger generations are a little bit more open to this, but generally with mental health, this is something to not discuss it is stigmatized. To have a diagnosis is like another level of stigmatization. His beliefs around substance use, our culture's belief around substance use, quite frankly, like his ability in his social position to share this story, his access to media, his access to like the resources to be able to share this and not have really repercussions. That's a cultural piece of this story of protection in your story. That's not everybody is afforded that in our society, in our culture. So those would just be some examples of the macro system. Anything that stood out that I missed that you really wanted to share or highlight?
Yeah, there were a couple other things we talked about within the macro system, just kind of general gender roles and how, you know, men are expected to kind of hold their emotions inside themselves, and, you know, that can influence, you know, having a panic attack because he's just always been expected to not express those emotions.
Of course.
And also he mentioned he coped with his anxiety by just becoming a workaholic.
Yep.
And I think that's not specifically unique to the United States, but it's definitely one of our values in the United States is to throw ourselves into our work and our career.
Right.
And, you know, 40-hour work weeks have become 60, 70-hour work weeks. And that's like, we pride ourselves on that.
Absolutely. It's a big piece of our identity. Like what I just think of when you meet somebody, what's one of the first things you ask them? What do you do? It's like, that's one of the defining characteristics of our existence. So his identity is largely defined by his job as a news anchor. And the system of capitalism that we live in loves that. Identify as much with your job as you can. That's what keeps us going. All right, so I'm going to do quite a bit of talking for a little bit, but as always, okay, actually, nope, I'm going to stop this share. So if you guys, well, no, I'm not going to stop the share. I'm going to share this. So I can't see all of you, but you can, so here's a choice. And let me know if I might like even give you guys too many choices. So again, I want you to really interact with the content that is being shared with you in this class. So the likelihood of us having time to talk about this in groups as well as finish the lecture, like I think we'd have to, so if we went into groups, we probably wouldn't finish the lecture, but we could finish the lecture if we didn't go into groups. Would you guys like to go into breakout groups one more time and kind of talk a little bit about your experiences with reading the material? Or would you rather, so I'll stop the share here, or would you rather kind of plug through the lecture? So votes for just the lecture and no breakout rooms. Ooh. I think that's probably more than half. Okay, so I'll go ahead and talk with you guys about the lecture. Thanks, Miles. All right, so I'm going to go through the material in the order that we read it. So really what I'm doing at this point is highlighting pieces of the reading. Please feel free to interact with me. I'm going to minimize all of you so I can see everything that's on my PowerPoint. But yeah, please just speak up if you have something to say about it. So the epilogue really starts off talking a lot about like institutions and systems that are really set up to protect perpetrators and to not at all protect survivors. So one of the examples that was used here, so again, I want you to just think of like the context of the individuals that may be coming to you. So in the epilogue, there was the concept of military sexual trauma that happens. So really at its core, it's a way to, so the military largely, so it's this structure that really tolerates and potentially even condones sexual assault by virtue of, this very strong hold on protecting the reputation or the status quo of a system or an institution. And the military is an institution. So in terms of, so as we know, women, individuals identifying as women entering into the armed forces, that's more recent than men being in the armed forces. So the idea behind military sexual trauma is this encouraging and highlighting this inferior status of women in the military. So then there's the concept of institutional betrayal. So these are things, in the macro system. So essentially what happens is, so institutional betrayal, one of the big institutions that we highlight with this, college campuses. So college campuses, like, who mostly are they trying to appease? Donors. Do donors care about the reputation of the institution? Absolutely. Do they want to protect it at any cost? Likely. So institutional betrayal of, if an individual experiences a sexual assault, for example, on campus, there is no incentive for this individual to report this. Particularly if the perpetrator is an athlete at a large institution, if they are a star athlete at a large institution. So again, I'm giving examples here, but I want to highlight the institutional betrayal of survivors of any sort of trauma, violence, assault. So as we know, or potentially as any of us maybe have experienced personally, or family and friends, that if an individual experiences an assault on a college campus, then usually the survivor victim, again, the language around this depends on how the client wants to be identified. They can be humiliated. You can see in quotations here, slut shamed. That's usually pretty gender specific. And ultimately, in many instances, they drop out of college because it's just the easiest thing to do. It's something to get away from the consistent denial or hurt, the rumors, just all of the attention, negative attention that can be brought to this individual. And ultimately, institutions like that, because the problem has now left the institution. The perpetrator hasn't. They're not the problem. The person who is vocalizing a failure of an institution is the problem. So the common theme here is a profound breach of trust that occurs by those who are in a position of power, in a position of authority, and they don't do anything about it. So like an act of omission or an act of commission, just being a very vocal denial or a refusal to change policies. So essentially what they're really doing is taking the side of the perpetrator. And then, like I said, in these instances, if the integrity of the institution is compromised, the more people will work to cover up whatever has happened to protect the reputation of that institution. So remember, institutions are, our criminal justice system is an institution. Colleges are institutions. So the institution's goal is to protect the reputation, and really they don't have any incentive or desire to aid the survivor or the victim. Then we learned about the concept of dissociative amnesia. So one of the things that came to my mind immediately when I was reading this was when Dr. Christine Blasey Ford came forward during the Brett Kavanaugh, what was it called? When they were confirming the confirmation. Yes, thank you. The confirmation. And, so something that was incredibly insensitive and, probably very political in nature is when Dr. Ford had difficulty recalling details of what had happened. What we know with trauma is that this is incredibly common. Even things that would seemingly be like maybe obvious or something that would be difficult to mistake or forget, it happens. So when she was, unable to identify the exact day of the week or the exact time or what she was wearing, these are not uncommon things to not be able to recall. Because again, going into some of the neurobiology of this, when you are in a crisis, when you are in a traumatic experience, your body is going to do whatever it can to protect you. And trauma affects our HPA axis. It invokes our fear system. Our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are like our central nervous system is affected and engaged. So your body beyond your brain is doing all kinds of things to protect itself. So neuroimaging studies on brains show deactivation in the right brain circuit when dissociative amnesia has happened, which is, again, common in traumatic responses. So this is the circuit that's normally operative in the retrieval of emotional autobiographical memories. So again, one of those, when I talk about captivity, one of the characteristics of that can be what's called constricting, which is really minimizing or limiting our emotional range. And that's adaptive. It is to adapt to a very inhumane way to exist. So just wanting to highlight some of the institutional nature and some of, again, those macro system and then that microsystem. And I would argue it's even like, smaller than a microsystem responses to trauma.
Dr.
Okay.
Williams, can I add something real quick?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot today, so I'll make it quick. But in the context of the military sexual trauma, something that I thought of while reading was I recently learned that dogs that are in the military they're assigned a rank 1 higher than their handler. So a dog is always 1 rank higher than their handler. And the reason for that is to prevent abuse toward the dog.
Wow.
Because if the handler were to abuse the dog, then they would get charged with a superior officer.
Okay.
And I just thought that was really, really frustrating and depressing that dogs are given more safety and protection than women in the military.
Yeah. Which, thank you so much for that, Miles, which as we know, can be expanded into many areas of our human existence, of animals being, given more attention. And again, it's not a competition, but I think it speaks to our culture of this protection that's not given to everybody. So in terms of trauma, I'm very excited for those of you who haven't read The Body Keeps the Score. There's so much to learn. It's such a dense book, but it's so informative. So for anything that you're not assigned in class, I would really encourage you to read it in its totality. So in terms of development and when an individual experiences abuse or neglect, some kind of trauma, there has been shown to be differential effects depending upon your personal life cycle development or developmental stage that you are in. So one thing that I wanted to add that we learned from the text was, you can see here, disturbances in the brain systems that organize the fight, flight, or freeze response. There actually is a 4th response called Fawn, and Fawn is really like a very kind of instinctual tendency to just agree, to placate, to oblige. So sometimes when we are in those positions, what we do is we just cater to whatever the needs are to everybody else, and that's what's considered fawning. so when an individual is in danger, that is also a response. So one of the things, like I was just talking about, the current approaches. So again, we're not great in our treatment. Our current approach is more so conceptualize PTSD as a disorder of fear. So one thing that we did do in the DSM-5, kind of revision of the DSM, is we moved PTSD from an anxiety disorder into kind of its own category, but still our treatments are more fear focused. And what we know neurobiologically is that the system that responds to fear is not the only system that's activated. So just to keep that in mind. So any sort of early trauma, so again, looking if we have children in our care, if we are working with adults who have a history of abuse or neglect when they were children, we have to take that stuff into consideration, because there's potential that their brain is functioning on a neurobiological level that's different than how we might approach an individual who hasn't had that experience. So early life trauma affects our emotional brain, which is the right side of our brain, and that develops really rapidly. And so if we're thinking of aspects of sociability and connection, that those are parts of our brain that can be negatively influenced, that can have lasting lifelong effects without intervention. So as you guys did with yourself with the therapist assignment, adverse childhood experiences scores are some of the most powerful predictors of any sort of clinical depression or suicidal behavior. And that's research that's been going on for many decades. So that this could potentially be something, so Paige, to speak to what you shared earlier, this could be something of an assessment that you could add into your clinical work. Just again, it's a baseline understanding of your client. So any data that you can gather on your client will better inform the care that you provide. So relational and attachment disconnection was also discussed. Again, the early relational disconnection is a very profound experience for a growing human. So if you are not able to connect to and relate to your caregivers, that's going to provide a schema for you growing and inform the way that you relate to and connect to other people. So one thing that I wanted to share with you, and I won't go into this very heavily, but just some examples of some big T trauma and little T trauma. So again, they're not like, they're just conceptualized a little bit different, but the reason I want to show you little T traumas is to not overlook that as something that is incredibly influential as well. And something that an individual can really be affected by. So just, something for your reference moving forward. One thing that I wanted to highlight, that again, I always want to invite you to be critical of the information that's shared with you. And always look at it from a critical lens, because I think that's important for the way that we just process the information that's coming to us. So as we know, our statistics on any sort of sexual violence, sexual assault, very conservative, probably much lower than the actual incidences, because again, there's no incentive to report. In fact, there are only reasons to not report, because even when individuals come forward, either nothing happens or their lives are negatively affected. So one of the things that was said in the text that I wanted to highlight is the concept of courage, and that it is, so if we talk about the courage to come forward, what is the subtext of that? It is not courageous to not come forward. And I really want to challenge that, because I think to conceptualize people who choose to not report or not come forward, that is not taking into account the systems at work against this individual. So it's not, to me, it's not about courage, it's about some level of awareness, but also really understanding and taking into account kind of what somebody would be stepping into to do this. So I don't want you to, I don't want you to think that like the best outcome or the only way to really move through and process a trauma that is like criminal is to report, because what we know are the systems that are in place very well might just cause more suffering for this individual. So I just really wanted to challenge that notion of courage and stepping forward. One of the things that we can absolutely provide, and that's been shown to be very helpful for survivors, is validation, and just saying like what you experienced is real, and it is affecting you, and it's like, you know, the concept of this is not your fault, because there's a lot of self-blame in this, but also there's a desire for this public acknowledgement that what this individual did is super messed up, and I'm not culpable for this. And so beyond social validation, one of the things that survivors really would like is vindication. So really for their communities to stand up and say, I support this person, I stand next to, I stand behind, however they want this person, because this person's story is meaningful and it's valid and it's important and it's valuable. And many times survivors don't get that, but I think that that's something that we can on a smaller scale potentially provide for them, or potentially connect them with like communities that will validate their experience, because trauma is inherently very isolating. So one of the things that we really want to promote in our work with individuals who've experienced trauma is a social connection. So I wanted to probably go over a review a little bit of, because Erickson's stages were mentioned in the book. Again, I will highlight this over and over and over again. You will see this in the staged models that we cover in class, is recovery starts with safety. That is a baseline need, a foundational need before you get anywhere else in your work. So if you look at, so Erickson outlined these capacities for autonomy. So autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority. So if trust is damaged at any of these points, that's going to affect the development moving forward. So this is just a different way to say what I said earlier of, you know, early trauma has kind of a bit of a domino effect, where you have to attend to the hurt and the stage at which the person was at. And again, our stages are, you know, they're relative. They're meant to be adapted. They don't fit perfectly for everybody. But basically all sequential developmental stages are affected after that hurt. So what we want to do is kind of return to that space, understand it, heal it as much as we can for movement, because there's like a reconceptualization that needs to happen moving forward from that. So obviously you can't like be 2 again or be 3 again, but you can understand that experience from your current developmental stage in your current place in life, and then move forward from that, and essentially like healing at each stage and understanding how the hurt at the autonomy versus shame and doubt stage affected you in your preschool, school age, adolescence. So recovery is always possible. And the one thing that I wanted to highlight here was patience, that basically what we've learned with our research is that the earlier a hurt has happened or a trauma has happened, that likely indicates a longer process, a longer healing process. Again, because all of those sequential stages have potentially been damaged. So this again is not an absolute, That doesn't necessarily always happen because again, it depends on your resources, your community support, your, had there been some kind of intervention earlier on? Is this the first time 30 years later that you're talking about this? All of these factors affect one's recovery process. So again, I'm going to highlight this all day, every day. One of the things that I think we assume in error with a client coming into our space is that they trust us. I am a professional. I should be trusted. And sometimes that is like creating trust, creating safety ultimately can be a goal of therapy versus just this, a precondition of treatment is how it was formulated in the book. So just please don't assume that just because somebody has voluntarily come into therapy means that they're like ready to process, that they're ready to process with you, that they trust you, that they feel safe, that is the bulk of the work. So making sure that you attend to that, and that is always going to be the what you privilege and what you work the hardest on in your work with individuals with trauma, and quite frankly, all of your clients. So
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I just think that I just have a comment about that because I just think it's really interesting.
Sure.
And kind of based on like, I feel like the class has heard this a bunch, but I had a therapist who I felt like was a good therapist, and then it ended up being like just kind of a bad experience because of some of the way that she practiced, or not, I don't know, just some of stuff she said, our relationship, all of that stuff. And I feel like part of it could have been like that trust that she assumed.
Yeah.
And like, I'm thinking of this with other clients too. And like us seeing clients that we like assume, oh, they trust us. So this person they're showing us in these first couple sessions and these things they're talking about in these first couple sessions, like are the main problem.
Yeah.
When like in reality, they might be showing you like a version of themselves that, that they show for their own like safety or protection or any of those things.
Yeah.
Which like, I just kind of had an epiphany of like, oh, wow, maybe that's a big reason why that experience was bad and we didn't get anywhere. And also like to note for sure with like future clients of like really giving the time and space for that and not assuming that they're just trusting us right away.
Absolutely. And to further your point, thank you so much for sharing that, is keeping the possibility open that either one or both of those are existing. So I may show you a version of me in one instance or in one topic, and then I may be fully authentic in the next moment. So just keeping the possibility open for yourself that you're seeing a version of an individual, a potentially filtered version and an unfiltered version, and that both of them are valid and both of them exist for a reason. And obviously the hope is, this transparency in who we are, but that also assumes safety. So to say you're safe in here, you can be who you are in here. And then the expectation that person just walks out and does that in their everyday life, that they may be fully with you before they're ever ready to be fully themselves outside of that space. So just knowing that you might get a different version of the individual than they show other people, because I'm sure that each of you can relate to that of, you probably have a version of you in class versus a version of you with your best friends or with your family. And that's not uncommon. So, and our goal always in therapy is like the integration of these pieces of us, these versions of us, but also having a lot of patience in that process, that you may learn of a completely different human 6 months into therapy, and that's to be expected. That's not, and to not take that personally, like, oh, they were withholding this because of something I personally did. I really want to challenge you to not lean into that, but also to not take any accountability. So I think I I could probably really digress here about talking about like resistant clients and how we take none of that onus sometimes. I think that we have to walk this line of like accountability and responsibility, and then letting our client just be. So I'm just I'm on a soapbox again about the concept of resistant clients, because I think sometimes there are things that we do that, you know, we're not attending to the safety, therefore our clients aren't going to be as present with us. But I digress. We'll get there. So again, just another way to punctuate this is moving directly into the work. So stage 2 of some of the staged, so this is particularly the triphasic model that's being discussed right here. With beginning therapists, many times we feel a lot of pressure to do the work, right? You're coming to me for recovery, for, you know, healing, for connection, whatever it is. So let's get to it. And we overlook the importance of that rapport building and the safety and the joining. So if you're ever finding that maybe a client isn't moving in a direction that you're expecting, 1, make sure that you're aware that it's your expectation, and 2, maybe pulling back and attending more to that therapeutic relationship, because you can't do anything if the client doesn't trust you and doesn't feel safe with you. So just not putting so much pressure on yourselves to do work and to like get to processing, because sometimes that can be months down the line with a client. So when an individual is working on safety is internal. So they have to feel safe within their own body. So just some possibilities for you in terms of referrals or resources. And again, this isn't exhaustive. This was just something that was mentioned in the book as a possibility, is this like reconnecting with your body. Because you can, when you are in crisis, or when you are in a traumatic experience, particularly a prolonged traumatic experience, you can really lose touch with your own body and your feelings, your functioning. So that's where something like yoga or some sort of meditation, progressive relaxation, something that's really mindful and connecting yourself back with just, you know, your attending to your heartbeat, attending to your breath, just becoming kind of reacquainted with your body pre-trauma, and engaging and balancing the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So one of the things that is talked about in the Body Keeps the Score is, so maybe this is something that you're familiar with, but the cortisol production when we're under stress. The interesting thing about cortisol is cortisol actually is dispensed when you're coming down from stress. So a cortisol is kind of showing, is an indicator to your body that like we're safe again. So if no cortisol is produced, or cortisol is consistently produced, that's an indication of an imbalance. So again, if a person is like really unsure of where to start, or kind of unsure about where they are, a medical, again, if they have resources, a medical referral or some sort of like blood work could be helpful to understand how the body is responding outside of the brain with any sort of trauma or something, some, you know, negative life experience that has happened. And one of the things that you can encourage with your clients is the idea of approaching your body with curiosity as opposed to fear. So, because it really does matter our reaction to what we're feeling in our body. So once somebody's becoming reacquainted, there can be some fear in that, or when they're not in touch with their body, there can just be inherent fear about what's going on. So this is just something to keep in mind, of that shift of perspective of being curious about what's happening rather than having this like kind of tight negative reaction to what's going on. So I'll just cover this last. We'll just roll over into next week with all of this. We have a few to continue with, but we'll get this in next week. So in terms of recovery, so I'll cover the epilogue and then we'll leave captivity for next week. one of the approaches that was covered in the book was the STARE NST. So this is skills training in effective and interpersonal relations and narrative storytelling. So again, prior to recalling the trauma, processing the trauma, this approach promotes self-care, emotional regulation, and relationships. So sometimes what you'll see in some of the approaches is that the last stage is kind of a reconnection of a community building. What STARE NST does is it privileges that and starts that at the beginning. So trying to build this community so that when this person is ready to recall the trauma or process the trauma, that they have people that they'll be able to do that with extra therapeutically if they choose to. So I oscillate between patients and clients because sometimes you will be at like an inpatient or hospital setting, and individuals who are in that setting are considered patients. But if you're in an outpatient setting outside of a hospital, you generally call the people who come to you clients. So just letting you know the difference with that. So these individuals are seen weekly for 16 to 24 weeks, but those first 16 weeks are the only ones that are structured. And then those last 8 weeks are really for, again, this really is dependent upon resources. Like, is this person able to pay? Do they have insurance? Do they have time? You know, does this group run, or am I available to this individual when they're not working? So just a lot of things to consider here. So there's a manual for the first 16 weeks. And then the last 8 weeks, you are able to kind of cater to the individual to see if you need anything beyond that. All right, last slide for the day, therapist factors. So these are the things that we've been talking about that you can bring into the relationship. So what has been shown to be very effective and helpful with retention, with trust building, with rapport building, are characteristics such as empathy, being non-judgmental, having warmth, and being genuine. So you want to model to your clients genuineness. And one of the things that you can do to do that is self-disclosure. And I know that there's mixed views on that. Sometimes you're told don't disclose anything. I tend to be a little bit more liberal with my self-disclosure because I think it's a way to connect as a human with another person in front of me, but I'm very aware of making sure that I'm not spending too much time talking about myself. But again, these are some of the strongest predictors of what are considered good treatment outcomes, which really means that the client has reached their goals. So what we're finding is that the technique or the approach that we use is a lot less influential in outcomes than that therapeutic alliance or that therapeutic relationship. So that's what you want to focus on. So very apt in the the topic that we're talking about. But another thing to keep in mind is, particularly with individuals who have experienced some sort of isolation or who feel very alone in their experience, that group can be pretty helpful for that, because it's a way to work against or counter, I'll say counter this feeling of shame, because shame likes silence, shame likes isolation, and that social isolation. So it's a way to build a community. And so if you were to provide groups, the suggestion is to have some kind of structure so that it's not just kind of self-led and you can go wherever. That structure provides some safety and predictability for your group members. So I'll stop there. Does anybody have any questions or comments